Before we begin, let me welcome you to Family Shadows, a place where we tell the stories that so often go unheard, the quiet sacrifices of fathers, the shadows they live in, and the light they give to their families. If you find meaning in stories of love, loss, and lessons learned, we invite you to subscribe and walk this journey with us. Each story is not only about one man's struggle, but about all of us, our parents, our children, ourselves. And now, today's story. My son-in-law said I was too simple for his family, so I gave him a lesson in class. William Carter was 68 years old when he first realized the world thought him too simple. Not that he hadn't heard whispers before. Life had a way of branding men like him with labels: ordinary, plain, unrefined. But William had long learned to carry those words the way one carries old scars, quietly, without complaint. He had grown up in a working-class neighborhood in Ohio, the son of a factory worker and a homemaker. His father's hands were calloused, his mother's voice was soft but firm, and between them they passed down an ethic of honesty and dignity. William became a carpenter by trade, building cabinets, staircases, and sometimes entire rooms with wood that seemed to speak to him. He had never been rich, but he had never been ashamed either. His late wife, Margaret, used to say, "Billy, you don't need polish when you've got heart." And for 40 years of marriage, he believed her. When she died 12 years ago, the house felt emptier than he thought possible, but his daughter Anna filled the silence with her laughter, her achievements, her hopes. Anna was the son of his life. He raised her with the same calloused hands that built so many homes, hands that fixed her bicycles, braided her hair clumsily, and worked overtime so she could attend the schools she dreamed of. William was never good with poetry, but if you asked him what love looked like, he would point to Anna. Now she was 32, married and radiant in the way young professionals in big cities often are. She wore tailored suits, drove a Lexus, and spoke with confidence at her law firm. William beamed with pride each time he saw her, but pride has a shadow. The first time William met Richard Hale's extended family, it was a dinner at an upscale country club. He remembered stepping through tall glass doors and being greeted by marble floors and chandeliers that looked like frozen waterfalls. William wore his best navy blue blazer, the one Margaret had once told him made him look distinguished. Anna looked relieved to see him. "Dad, you look great," she whispered, squeezing his hand. He thought he caught a flicker of hesitation in Richard's eyes, but brushed it off. The table was long, draped in white linen, surrounded by Richard's parents, siblings, and aunts and uncles with perfect smiles. Their conversations spun around wine labels, vacation homes in the Hamptons, and which private schools their children had secured admissions to. William mostly listened. He nodded politely, asked a few questions about their travels, and laughed softly when someone told a joke. To him, this was enough, to be present, to support his daughter, to belong, even if only by her side. But belonging is not always given. The night grew late. After dinner, William stepped aside to admire a painting hung near the club's entrance, something abstract, colors bleeding into one another like emotions. He didn't notice Richard approaching until he spoke. "Dad," Richard said, he only ever used that word in public as if rehearsing politeness. "A word if you don't mind." William turned, smiling faintly. "Of course." Richard's voice lowered, his tone edged with impatience. "My family, they are a certain way. You've probably noticed. They're used to a certain level of class. And well," he hesitated, then exhaled as if settling on the crueler truth. "You're too simple for them. It's not your fault. It's just you don't quite fit in." The words landed like stones dropped in William's chest. Too simple. For a moment he didn't speak. He thought of the nights he stayed up sanding wood until his hands bled so Anna could have textbooks for college. He thought of Margaret's laughter when he brought home daisies instead of roses because daisies were cheaper but lasted longer like us. He thought of driving Anna to debate tournaments in a rusted Ford, cheering her louder than anyone in the crowd. Too simple. He looked at Richard, his jaw tightening, but his voice was steady. "Well, son," he said quietly, "simple wood makes sturdy furniture." Richard gave a thin smile, not catching, or perhaps not caring for the metaphor. I'm just saying, Dad, for everyone's comfort, maybe keep things understated. No need to draw attention. And with that, he walked away. William remained by the painting, his reflection caught in its glass frame. An old man in a second-hand blazer, his hands folded in front of him. He wondered if Margaret could see him now, if she would whisper the words that used to mend his heart. But the only voice he heard was Richard's, too simple. That night, William drove home alone. The highway lights flickered against his windshield, and with each mile he sank deeper into silence. He thought of Anna. She hadn't heard the words, or had she? He wasn't sure, but he knew she had grown accustomed to this new world of elegance, where forks were lined in neat rows and laughter carried hints of superiority. Would she ever see him the same way? Would she, too, feel embarrassed by his rough hands, his modest home, his plain talk? William shook his head. No, Anna was different. She had been raised on peanut butter sandwiches and bedtime stories told in his gravelly voice. She had seen him work through winters with frost on his beard. She had hugged him after every school play, every graduation, every heartbreak. Still, doubts creep in easily when you've been told you don't belong. By the time William parked in his driveway, the word simple had carved itself into him like initials on wood. He stepped out of the car, looked up at the stars, unchanged, unjudging, and whispered, "Margaret, I hope I'm still enough." The next morning, William sat at his kitchen table, sipping coffee from a chipped mug. He stared at his hands. They were broad, lined with years of labor, knuckles scarred from slipped hammers and splinters. Hands that built furniture for strangers' homes. Hands that built a life for Anna. What was class, anyway? Was it money, cars, fine suits? Or was it something quieter, the way a man treated others, the respect he gave, the humility he carried? William didn't have answers, but he had one certainty. He would not let Richard's words steal his dignity. In the days that followed, William kept the conversation to himself. Anna called, as she often did, asking how he was. He answered warmly, masking the weight in his chest. He asked about her cases at the firm, about her new apartment, about whether she and Richard had thought about children yet. He did not tell her that her husband had dismissed him as too simple. Some burdens, he decided, should not be passed on. But silently, William made a promise. He would show, not with anger, not with bitterness, but with quiet strength, what true class meant. He did not yet know when the moment would come, but he knew it would. And when it did, Richard would learn a lesson no private school, no polished dinner table, no wealthy lineage could ever teach. That night at the country club was the beginning. It was the first crack in a fragile mirror, the moment a father realized his worth was being measured by the wrong scales. What Richard Hale could not see, and what William Carter had yet to prove, was that class is not stitched into a suit or etched into a last name. It is carved in the heart, in the choices a man makes when no one is watching, and in the sacrifices that echo long after he is gone. William Carter was simple, but simplicity, when sharpened by dignity, has a way of humbling the proud. This was only the beginning of his lesson. Anna Carter had always seen her father as her anchor. Growing up in a modest neighborhood, she carried with her the rhythm of his footsteps on creaking wooden floors, the sound of hammer against nail echoing in the evenings, and the steady voice that reminded her to stand tall, no matter what the world says. As a child, Anna had been the one student in her class with hand-me-down shoes and a lunchbox that sometimes held little more than peanut butter sandwiches. Yet she never felt lacking. Her father's presence made her proud, as if his quiet dignity compensated for anything they couldn't afford. Other kids boasted about new toys. Anna boasted about the books her father bought from yard sales, the bedtime stories he spun out of thin air, and the way he could carve a block of wood into something magical. By the time she was in high school, Anna was known as the girl whose father never missed a debate, never missed a recital, never once let her walk home alone. He might have arrived in a rusted pickup truck, his boots covered in sawdust, but he was there, always there. That constancy carried her into adulthood. When she became the first in her family to attend college, she knew it was her father's sacrifices, extra shifts, skipped vacations, the endless carpentry orders that had paved her way. He never said it outright, but Anna noticed the new cracks in his hands, the stoop of his back, the way he hid his cough during winter to avoid worrying her. For her, success wasn't just personal, it was repayment. She worked relentlessly at law school, graduated with honors, and landed a job at a prestigious firm in the city. Every milestone, she thought of William. When she walked across the stage at graduation, she looked past the sea of faces and found him. An old man in a simple suit, standing straighter than usual, clapping until his palms were red. That memory alone could have carried her through anything. But life has a way of testing loyalties. When Anna first met Richard Hale at a networking event, she was struck by his confidence. He carried himself as though the world owed him attention. His words were smooth, his smile well-practiced, and his lineage, the Hale name, was something he wore as if it were an accessory. At first, Anna didn't care about his wealth. She was drawn to his determination, his vision of the future, the way he seemed to know where he was going. To a young woman exhausted from years of proving herself, his certainty was magnetic. Richard courted her with dinners at fine restaurants, weekends at ski resorts, and tickets to shows she had only read about in magazines. He told her she deserved it. He told her she belonged with him in a world of refinement and elegance. For a time, Anna believed him. She convinced herself that she could bridge two worlds, the humble home where she grew up and the glittering social circles of the Hales. She thought she could hold both truths without conflict, but the cracks appeared early. The first time Anna brought Richard to her father's house, the air smelled faintly of varnish and pine wood. William had spent the day polishing the old dining table Margaret had loved. He wanted everything to shine for his daughter's guest. Richard was polite enough, shaking William's hand firmly, offering a smile that didn't quite reach his eyes, but Anna saw it. The way Richard's gaze swept across the small living room, lingering on the outdated curtains, the faded photographs, the old armchair with stuffing peeking from one corner. They sat down for dinner. William had cooked pot roast, a recipe Margaret once perfected. Richard complimented the meal, but when William poured wine from a budget bottle he'd bought at the local store, Richard's pause was noticeable. His smile was thinner. Later, when they left, Richard muttered under his breath in the car, "He's quaint." Anna bristled. "He's my father." I know," Richard said quickly, holding up his hands. "I just mean he's simple. Nothing wrong with that. But you live in a different world now, Anna. Just be prepared." She wanted to argue. She wanted to tell him that her father's simplicity was more valuable than any wine label, that his humility was worth more than all the polished silverware in Richard's parents' home. But instead, she fell silent. A part of her wondered if Richard was right, if she truly did live in a different world now. And that silence planted a seed of guilt. As the years passed, Anna tried to balance the two halves of her life. She visited her father often, bringing groceries, sitting at the old kitchen table, listening to him tell stories about the neighbors. She laughed, she hugged him, and she always felt at home. But when she returned to Richard's side, it was as if a curtain dropped. The conversations were sharper, focused on careers, investments, and social climbing. Richard's family measured worth by property and pedigree. Anna found herself speaking less about her father, not because she was ashamed, but because she feared the quiet judgment in their eyes. And then came the night at the country club. She had invited William with pride, hoping her two worlds might meet, even if uneasily. She wanted Richard's family to see what she saw, the man who had raised her, the man whose hands had built not only furniture but her very foundation. But she had seen Richard's discomfort. She had heard his subtle sighs when William mispronounced a French dish, the tight smile when her father asked simple, earnest questions at the table, and when she glanced around, she caught her uncles-in-law exchanging smirks, as if William were some novelty they could afford to patronize. That night after dinner, Anna searched for her father and found him by the painting near the entrance. She didn't hear the words exchanged between him and Richard, but she saw the look in her father's eyes afterward, the way his shoulders carried a new weight, the way his smile was present but not whole. She knew something had been said, and she hated herself for not pressing him about it. In the weeks that followed, Anna lived in quiet turmoil. She loved Richard, at least she told herself she did. He was ambitious, caring in his own way, and had given her a life of comfort she hadn't thought possible. But her father's presence lingered in her heart like a compass. She found herself defending him in conversations Richard didn't even start. "You know, Dad worked extra shifts to pay for my schooling," she told Richard one morning over breakfast. "That's admirable," Richard replied absently, scrolling through his phone. "More than admirable. He gave up everything for me, you should know that." Richard glanced up, surprised by her sharp tone. "Anna, I respect your father, truly, but you don't need to justify him to me." But she did. She needed to remind herself, that William Carter was not a man to be dismissed. Yet each time she visited her father, she felt the subtle tug of two worlds pulling her apart. Her father's house was filled with warmth but lacked polish. Her husband's home was filled with polish but lacked warmth. She wanted them to meet in the middle, but the distance only seemed to grow. Then came the invitation to the charity auction. It arrived in an elegant envelope, embossed with golden lettering. Richard waved it in the air with a grin. "This is the event of the season. Politicians, executives, donors, you name it. We need to make an impression." "We?" Anna asked. "Of course, you and me," and he hesitated, his brow furrowing slightly. "I suppose we should invite your father. Optics, you know." "Optics," she repeated, her voice cooling. "Yes, optics. It looks good if the whole family is involved. But Anna, please make sure he understands the atmosphere. This isn't the place for simplicity." Anna's jaw tightened. She wanted to shout at him, to tell him that her father had more class in his worn-out boots than the entire guest list combined. But she only said, "He'll be fine." And she resolved then and there, whatever her father chose to do at that auction, she would stand by him. The night of the auction, William Carter would walk into a world designed to exclude men like him. But Anna knew something Richard didn't. Her father had never needed permission to belong anywhere. His dignity spoke louder than wealth. His love defined a different kind of class. She just didn't yet know how brightly that truth was about to shine. Richard Hale had been born into comfort. To him, marble floors and crystal chandeliers were as natural as sunlight, and the concept of scarcity was something he read about in history books, not something he had ever touched with his own hands. His childhood was a carousel of private schools, summer homes, and vacations in places other people only saw on postcards. His father, a corporate lawyer, and his mother, a patron of the arts, made sure Richard understood what it meant to carry the Hale name. "You are not just a boy," his father often said. "You are a brand." By the time he was in college, Richard had learned how to enter a room without asking for space, how to claim it with posture, tone, and a smile that hinted at exclusivity. He spoke in the polished cadence of a man accustomed to being listened to. He shook hands the way his father had taught him, firm, brief, unyielding. And he measured people the way his family measured wine, by origin, presentation, and the company they kept. So when he met Anna Carter, he saw a woman who was brilliant, ambitious, and capable of carrying herself among the elite. He admired her determination, though he secretly attributed much of her grit to coming from less. In his mind, it was a virtue she carried, like a scar turned into a story. What he hadn't expected was the shadow of her father. Richard remembered the first dinner at the small Carter home. He had been polite, of course. The Hale family believed in courtesy, even when condescension lay beneath it. William Carter greeted him with a firm handshake and a warm smile that seemed genuine if unpolished. But Richard noticed the details. The worn edges of the furniture, the paint peeling in the hallway, the scent of varnish lingering in the air. He saw the way William's blazer fit loosely at the shoulders, as if it had been bought off the rack and worn too many times. Richard smiled through dinner, but he catalogued each detail the way one might make mental notes at an appraisal. In his mind, William was nice, perhaps even hardworking, but he lacked the refinement that Richard believed defined class. To Richard, class was a performance. The right words at the right time, the right wine at the right moment, the right clothes in the right place. William, with his straightforward talk and simple tastes, disrupted the performance. And Richard did not like disruptions. In the Hale family, image was currency. Every social interaction was an investment. Every gathering was an opportunity. Richard had grown up watching his parents navigate dinner parties like chess masters, placing themselves near power brokers, offering compliments that doubled as negotiations, laughing at jokes that sealed deals. It wasn't hypocrisy, it was strategy, and strategy was survival. Now, married to Anna, Richard carried the same burden. His colleagues, his family, his friends all expected consistency. They expected his wife to fit seamlessly into their world, and by extension, her family too. But William Carter did not fit. He was an outlier, a reminder that Anna's roots were not polished marble but rough wood. And Richard worried that someday, in some room, that fact would be used against him. Wasn't cruelty, he told himself. It was practicality. His father always said, "The world judges you by your weakest link." And Richard feared William was that link. The charity auction loomed large on Richard's calendar. It was the kind of event that defined social standing. Philanthropy in his circles was not about generosity, it was about visibility. To give was to be seen, and to be seen was to rise. The auction would host politicians, CEOs, and socialites. The Hale family intended to make a statement. Richard's father had already pledged a significant donation. His mother had arranged for artwork to be auctioned, and Richard himself was expected to play a role, one that would cement his image as a rising figure in both business and society. Anna was, of course, his partner in this performance. Her intelligence and poise would shine. But when Richard thought about inviting William, unease tightened his chest. He pictured William walking into the grand ballroom with his modest suit, his plain manner, his lack of familiarity with the unspoken rules of such gatherings. Richard feared whispers, smirks, maybe even outright questions. Who is that? Is that really Anna's father? Still, he knew appearances mattered. To exclude William would raise more questions than to include him. So Richard relented. He handed Anna the invitation and reminded her, gently but firmly, make sure he understands what kind of night this is. Richard rarely admitted it even to himself, but he felt threatened by William, not by his money. There was little to threaten there. Not by his education, which was modest compared to Richard's Ivy League background. What unsettled Richard was the quiet authority William carried without trying. The way his words, though simple, seemed rooted in something deeper. The way Anna's eyes softened when she looked at her father, as if no one else in the room mattered. Richard had spent his life curating admiration. William seemed to earn it without effort. And so, one night at the country club, when he found William admiring a painting, Richard let his insecurities slip into words. "You're too simple for my family." The phrase left his mouth with a weight he didn't expect. He had meant it as a practical observation, a caution. But the moment the words settled between them, he saw something flicker in William's eyes, pain, perhaps, or disappointment. Richard brushed it off. Better to be honest, he told himself later. Better for him to know his place. But some words do not vanish. They echo. In the days that followed, Richard hardly thought of it. He moved on to meetings, deadlines, and preparations for the auction. His world was filled with figures and forecasts, with conversations about stocks and strategies. If he remembered William at all, it was as a background detail, an obligation attached to his wife, a man who would someday fade quietly into the margins of their lives. But arrogance blinds as much as it shields. Richard did not see what was coming. He did not see that his words, tossed carelessly like stones into a pond, had stirred ripples far greater than he imagined. As the night of the auction approached, Richard grew restless. His father called him twice to review their pledges. His mother reminded him to smile for the cameras. Anna grew quieter, her loyalty pulled between husband and father. And William? Well, Richard assumed William would simply stand in the background, nodding politely, fading into the daycare. He thought of him as harmless. He thought of him as predictable. But he was wrong, because William Carter, in his quiet dignity, carried something Richard had never understood. And on the night of the auction, in a room filled with wealth and ego, Richard would learn that lesson the hard way. The dinner was meant to be celebratory. At least, that's what Anna had told her father when she called him earlier in the week. Richard's parents want to host something small before the auction, she said. Just family, nothing fancy. William chuckled softly on the phone. Small and nothing fancy, huh? Coming from the Hales, I'm guessing that means chandeliers and a 7-course meal. Anna laughed, though not as freely as she used to. Maybe, but Dad, it would mean a lot to me if you came. And that was all it took. For William, Anna's requests were not obligations, they were privileges. If she needed him, he would be there. Always. The Hale residence was no ordinary home. It was a mansion perched on a hill, its windows glimmering with warm light as if it were some beacon of wealth. The driveway curved like a ribbon, lined with trimmed hedges and imported stone fountains. William arrived in his old sedan, polished as best he could, though its age showed no matter how much wax he used. He stepped out wearing the same blazer he had worn to the country club, pressed carefully, paired with a tie Margaret had bought him decades ago. It wasn't stylish, but it carried history, and that to William mattered more. Inside, the dining room was a cathedral of taste, high ceilings with chandeliers dripping crystal, a mahogany table that could have seated 20 though only 10 chairs were filled, and silverware arranged so precisely that William hesitated before touching anything. "Dad," Anna said, hurrying to greet him, her smile both warm and nervous. "You look perfect." Richard was already at the table, wine glass in hand. He rose politely, kissed Anna on the cheek, then offered William a nod. "Glad you could make it, sir." William caught the formality in his voice. "Glad to be here," he replied, settling into the chair Anna pulled out for him. The meal began with small talk. Richard's mother, elegant in pearls, asked about Anna's work. Richard's father launched into a story about a recent golf tournament. The uncles and aunts traded comments about stocks, travel, and the latest theater productions. William listened quietly, adding a word here and there. When the conversation turned to art, he mentioned a piece he'd once repaired for a local church, a wooden cross restored from rot and neglect. He spoke gently, describing how the grain of the wood revealed its age. There was silence at the table for a beat too long. Then Richard's mother smiled thinly. "How quaint." The word stung more than she intended. Anna reached for her glass, cheeks coloring. The conversation shifted quickly back to auctions and investments. William's story was left behind, like a newspaper no one bothered to finish reading. Halfway through the meal, one of Richard's cousins leaned toward him with a grin. "So, Richard, I hear you're leading the bidding this year. What are you putting on the table?" Richard smirked. "Oh, we'll see. Something significant. The Hales don't come to charity events to blend in." There was laughter around the table. Then, almost as an afterthought, the cousin glanced at William. "And you, Mr. Carter, will you be joining the fun?" The question was casual, but the tone carried an edge. The table fell briefly quiet, eyes shifting. William cleared his throat. "I don't have much, son, but I believe in giving what I can." Richard's voice slipped in, smooth but sharp. "That's true. Dad's always taught me, it's not about how much you give, but how you present it. Sometimes giving less can, well, look out of place." The words slid into the air like a blade, polite, cloaked in sophistication, but cutting nonetheless. Anna's fork froze midair. "Richard," she whispered, a warning, but Richard only sipped his wine, eyes fixed ahead as if nothing had been said. William did not respond. He had learned long ago that not every battle was worth fighting in the open. Some wounds you carried quietly. He glanced at Anna, saw the way she avoided his eyes, her hand trembling slightly as she lifted her glass. He wanted to comfort her, to tell her he was fine, that he had endured harsher words from life itself. But the weight in his chest reminded him this was different. This was not the hardship of weather or work. This was rejection, delivered with a smile across fine china. He forced himself to eat, though each bite tasted of ash. Inside, Anna burned. She wanted to slam her fork down, to shout at her husband in front of his family, to remind them all that the man sitting quietly at the table had given her everything they admired in her. But she remained still. Years of living in Richard's world had trained her to keep composure. To argue here would be to admit weakness, and so she swallowed her anger the way her father swallowed his hurt. Yet in her silence, she felt complicit, and that was the cruelest cut of all. The evening dragged on with conversations about investments and travel, about wine collections and art dealers. William spoke less and less. He smiled when prompted, nodded when addressed, but his heart was far away, back in the small house where Margaret once laughed over burnt toast, back in the workshop where wood shavings fell like snow, back in the world where he was not too simple, but simply enough. By the time dessert was served, Anna wished desperately for the night to end. Later, when William excused himself and stepped into the cool night air, Anna followed him out. "Dad," she whispered, gripping his arm, "I'm so sorry." He smiled faintly, though it didn't reach his eyes. "For what, honey? They're just words. They shouldn't have been said. People show you who they are, Anna, that's all. Don't carry their words. Let me carry them." Her throat tightened. She wanted to beg him not to bear it alone, but the look in his eyes told her this was how he had always lived, shielding her from pain, even when it was directed at him. He kissed her forehead just as he had done when she was a child. "Get some rest, sweetheart. I'll see you at the auction." And with that, he climbed into his old sedan and drove into the darkness, leaving Anna on the driveway, torn between two worlds, her heart aching for the man who had given her everything and received nothing but quiet dismissal. Sleep did not come easily to William Carter that night. He sat by the window of his small living room, a single lamp glowing beside him, and let the hours pass in silence. Outside, the neighborhood lay still, the only sound the hum of distant traffic. Inside, his mind wandered, not forward but back to the beginning. He remembered the day Anna was born. Margaret's hand clutching his so tightly in the hospital bed, her hair damp with sweat, her eyes fierce with both pain and love. Then suddenly a cry that pierced through him like sunlight breaking through storm clouds. When the nurse placed that tiny bundle in his arms, William had whispered, "I'll take care of you, always." He meant it with every fiber of his being. The early years were not easy. Money was scarce, work was unpredictable. William took carpentry jobs wherever he could find them, repairing floors, building cabinets, fixing porches. There were weeks when the pay barely covered groceries. He would sometimes eat less so Margaret and Anna could have more. Yet he never complained. He found joy in the little things. The way Anna's tiny fingers curled around his thumb, the way she giggled when he carved her toys from scrap wood, the way Margaret hummed lullabies while folding laundry. They had little, but they had love, and that, he believed, was wealth enough. When Anna started school, William took on extra shifts. He worked late into the night, sanding planks until his hands blistered just so she could have new notebooks and fresh pencils. He remembered one particular winter when the furnace broke. The house was cold, and they could see their breath in the air. Margaret worried, but William built a small wood-burning stove from old iron parts, keeping them warm until he could save enough to fix the furnace properly. Anna had crawled into his lap that night, wrapped in a blanket, and said, "Daddy, you're like a superhero." William laughed softly then, but his eyes had stung with tears. He wasn't a superhero. He was just a man trying not to fail his family. From the very beginning, William wanted more for Anna. He wanted her to see the world beyond their modest street, to know opportunities he had never known. Education was the key, he believed. So when she showed promise in school, he pushed himself harder. He remembered the nights she stayed up late studying, and he sat at the table beside her, pretending to work on his carpentry books but really just keeping her company. He brewed coffee he didn't need, just to stay awake until she closed her books. When she joined the debate team, William was always there, front row, clapping too loudly, proud enough for an entire stadium. He drove her to tournaments in that old rusted Ford, sometimes sleeping in the parking lot while she competed inside. And when she won her first trophy, she ran straight into his arms, not caring about the applause from others. "We did it, Dad," she whispered. "We." That word alone was worth every blister, every sleepless night, every sacrifice. Life tested him again when Margaret passed away. The illness came fast, stealing her breath before he could accept what was happening. Suddenly, the house felt too large, too empty. William stood by her grave with Anna beside him, both of them clinging to each other, and he made another silent vow. He would be both father and mother to their daughter. He learned to cook meals Margaret used to make, even if they never tasted quite right. He learned to braid Anna's hair, fumbling at first until she giggled and taught him patiently. He sat through her heartbreaks, listening the way Margaret once had, giving advice in the best way he knew how. There were moments he felt he was failing, but Anna never let him believe it. She would hug him and say, "You're all I need, Dad," and he believed her. As Anna grew older, William remained rooted in his simple ways. He didn't care for fancy clothes or new cars. His workshop was his sanctuary, the smell of sawdust his comfort. He saved diligently, putting aside every extra dollar for Anna's future. He remembered the day he signed the check for her first semester of college. His hands trembled slightly, not because he didn't have enough, but because it symbolized years of sacrifice condensed into a single piece of paper. When Anna walked across that stage years later in her cap and gown, William felt taller than he ever had. Margaret should have been there, he thought, but perhaps she was watching from above, proud of the girl they had raised together. Now, decades later, those memories collided with the sting of Richard's words. Too simple. The phrase gnawed at him as he sat by the window. He thought of the countless nights he had gone without so Anna could have more. Was that simplicity? He thought of the trophies, the graduations, the victories that Anna had earned because he had chosen her dreams over his own comfort. Was that too simple? No. He decided it was not. He was not ashamed of his life. He was proud. Proud of the sweat in his palms, the calluses on his hands, the lessons he had instilled in his daughter. If that was simplicity, then perhaps the world needed more of it. As the clock ticked toward midnight, William rose from his chair. He walked to his workshop where tools hung neatly on the walls and wood shavings scattered the floor like fallen leaves. He ran his hand along the surface of the workbench, scarred from years of use. Here, in this place, he was not too simple. Here, he was a craftsman, a provider, a father who had given his life to shape something lasting, and somewhere deep inside, a quiet resolve formed. He didn't know how, he didn't know when, but he would show Richard and everyone else what true class looked like, not with words, not with anger, but with dignity, the kind of dignity that could not be bought, only lived. That night, as he finally drifted to sleep, William dreamed of Margaret's voice, soft, reassuring like it had always been. "Billy, you don't need polish when you've got heart." And he knew she was right. The invitation to dinner arrived the day before the charity auction. Richard called it a formality, a gathering of family to align expectations before the grand event. To the Hales, even generosity had to be rehearsed. For William, it was another test, a quiet gauntlet laid before him. The evening sky was painted in shades of purple and gold as William pulled into the long driveway of the Hale estate. His sedan looked out of place among the row of luxury vehicles already parked. Sleek German cars, an Italian sports model, a limousine stretching across the stone path. He stepped out, adjusted his blazer, and smoothed the tie Margaret had given him long ago. The house loomed above, its windows glowing with warmth that felt less like welcome and more like warning. Anna greeted him at the door, her smile tight, her eyes betraying worry. "Dad," she whispered, squeezing his hand, "thank you for coming." "For you, always," he said. His voice carried the weight of promises kept over decades. Inside, the dining room glittered with crystal and silver. A long mahogany table stood in the center, adorned with candles and fresh flowers. Richard's family was already seated, their conversations rising and falling like waves on a shore William had never walked. Richard rose to greet him, a glass of wine in hand. His smile was cordial, practiced. "Glad you could join us, sir." "Wouldn't miss it," William replied, settling into a chair at Anna's side. The table came alive with conversation. Richard's father recited recent stock performances, his mother commented on an art dealer from New York, and uncle boasted about his golf handicap. Laughter bubbled up, polished and rehearsed, like actors in a play they had performed many times before. William listened, his hands folded neatly in his lap. When spoken to, he answered briefly, kindly. He asked about their children, their travels, their work, but each reply felt like tossing a stone into deep water. The ripples vanished before they reached the surface. At one point, Richard's cousin leaned across the table, smiling with an edge too sharp to be friendly. "So, Mr. Carter, tomorrow's the big night. Will you be making a contribution?" The table stilled, eyes turned. Even the clinking of silverware seemed to fade. William cleared his throat. "I'll do what I can. Giving isn't about how much, it's about the heart behind it." There was a pause, then Richard's mother tilted her head, pearls glinting in the candlelight. "That's sweet, sweet." The word stung, coated in condescension. Richard took a sip of wine, then added smoothly, "My family has always believed that charity is also presentation. Sometimes too small a gesture can be misunderstood." The words hung in the air like smoke. Polite, almost invisible, yet suffocating. Anna's fork clattered softly against her plate. "Richard," she began, but her husband's eyes silenced her. William said nothing. He had learned long ago that silence can be stronger than speech. But inside, the words carved at him, reopening wounds that had not yet healed. He looked down at his hands, broad, scarred, calloused from years of labor. Hands that had built Anna's cradle. Hands that had mended their broken roof after a storm. Hands that had written check after check for her tuition. Too small a gesture. The phrase throbbed in his chest, yet he kept his face composed. He would not let them see the hurt. Anna sat rigid, her heart caught between fury and shame. She wanted to defend him, to stand up and declare before them all that her father's love had been her greatest fortune. But she feared the scene it would cause, the whispers afterward, the strain it would place on her already fragile marriage. So she swallowed her anger, pressing her hand under the table against William's. He squeezed it gently, as if to say, "It's all right. I've survived worse." But it wasn't all right, and Anna knew it. Near the end of the meal, Richard rose with his glass. "To tomorrow," he said, "to generosity, to class, and to carrying the Hale name with pride." The family echoed him, glasses raised, smiles gleaming. William lifted his water, his hand steady. He did not repeat the words. Instead, he murmured softly, almost to himself, "To dignity." Anna heard him, and her eyes filled with tears. When the meal ended, William excused himself with quiet grace. Outside, the night was cool, the stars bright against the darkness. He breathed deeply, letting the air cleanse him of the suffocating weight he had carried inside. Anna followed him to the car. "Dad," she whispered, her voice breaking, "I hate the way they treat you." He smiled, tired but gentle. "Don't hate. Sweetheart, pity maybe, but not hate. Promise me you won't let them make you feel less." He touched her cheek. "Anna, no one can take away what's already been lived. They didn't see the nights we shared books by candlelight. They didn't see the mornings I carried you on my shoulders. They can't measure what they've never known." Her throat tightened. "I wish Mom were here." "So do I," he said softly. "But tomorrow, maybe we'll remind them both what real class is." And with that, he drove away, his taillights fading into the night, leaving Anna with a strange certainty. The storm was coming, and her father, her simple, steadfast father, was about to change everything. The night of the auction arrived with all the pomp and ceremony the city's elite could muster. The Hale family had been talking about it for weeks. For them, the event was less about charity and more about affirmation, an annual reminder that they belonged at the top, that their names were synonymous with prestige. For William Carter, it was something else entirely. The auction was held at the Metropolitan Hall downtown, a building that seemed carved out of marble dreams. Massive columns rose to the sky, banners announcing the charity's mission hung gracefully across the entrance, and a red carpet rolled out like a river of velvet. Luxury cars lined the curb. Photographers snapped pictures as men in tailored suits, and women in shimmering gowns stepped out, their laughter ringing through the night air. The scent of expensive perfume lingered like invisible smoke. Richard arrived with Anna on his arm, his family close behind. He wore a tuxedo cut to perfection, his smile already in performance mode. "Remember," he whispered to Anna, "this is about presence. About making the right impression. Anna nodded, though her eyes drifted to the empty space behind them, waiting for another car to pull up. Moments later, William's old sedan rattled its way down the street and eased into a modest parking spot far from the flashing cameras. He stepped out slowly, his blazer pressed carefully, his shoes polished though worn at the edges. He carried himself with quiet dignity, a man who had nothing to prove and yet was about to be tested. Anna's face lit up when she saw him. She hurried over, hugging him tightly. "You made it," she whispered. "Wouldn't miss it," he said, echoing the words he had spoken so many times before. Richard glanced over, offering a curt nod. "Glad you could join us, sir. Just follow my lead tonight. It's a very particular crowd." William smiled faintly. "I've been in crowds before." The grand ballroom shimmered with chandeliers, their crystals scattering light across walls adorned with fine art. Tables were set with silverware that gleamed like mirrors. A stage stood at the front, where items for auction were displayed. Rare paintings, antique jewelry, vacations to exotic locations. As William entered, he felt eyes turn. Not all at once, but in small ripples, a glance here, a whisper there. He could sense it, the question that passed silently from person to person. Who is he? Richard led the way confidently, introducing Anna to acquaintances, shaking hands with potential partners. Each introduction was polished, each word rehearsed. He laughed when appropriate, nodded when expected, the very image of refinement. William stayed slightly behind, observing. He noticed how people measured each other with their eyes, scanning clothes, posture, jewelry. He noticed how conversations shifted depending on wealth, how laughter grew louder when someone mentioned a six-figure donation. It was a world he had never lived in, but he did not feel small, he simply felt apart. At one point, as they stood near the refreshment table, Richard leaned close to Anna. "Keep him close, but not too close. I don't want people confused." Anna's jaw tightened. "Confused about what?" "You know," Richard murmured, his eyes flicking toward William. "Optics?" Anna's gaze burned. "He's my father." Richard forced a smile as others approached. "Of course he is." William had heard. He said nothing, only sipped his water, his silence a shield. The auctioneer, a tall man with a booming voice, stepped onto the stage. The room hushed, anticipation humming in the air. "Ladies and gentlemen," he declared, "welcome to the annual gala for children's futures. Tonight, we gather not only to celebrate but to give, because giving is the truest measure of class." The irony was not lost on William. He folded his hands, listening. One by one, the items were presented. Hands shot up, numbers rose. A painting sold for $40,000. A vacation package went for $50,000. Applause followed each bid as though generosity were a performance to be judged. The Hales were in their element. Richard's father raised his paddle with a flourish, pledging impressive sums. Richard himself leaned forward, eyes gleaming, ready to make his mark. Anna clapped politely, though her heart felt heavy. She glanced at her father beside her, quiet still, his eyes focused not on the glittering items but on the children featured in the charity's brochures, their smiles fragile, their futures uncertain. Midway through the evening, the auctioneer paused. "And now," he said, "a special segment, donations pledged not for items, but directly for the cause. Tonight we invite those among you to stand, to pledge not for recognition but for impact." The room shifted. This was the true arena, the moment when names would be tied to numbers, when reputations would rise or falter. Richard straightened his tie, ready. His father lifted his chin. The family prepared for their moment. And then quietly, before anyone else could move, William Carter stood. The room stilled. Conversations froze. Even the auctioneer blinked in surprise. William's voice was calm, steady. "I would like to pledge." The auctioneer nodded, regaining his composure. "Of course, sir, and your name?" "William Carter." A murmur rippled through the room. Few recognized the name. Some glanced toward Richard, whispering, "Is that family?" Richard's smile stiffened, but he said nothing. The auctioneer gestured. "And your pledge, Mr. Carter?" William paused only a moment, then spoke with quiet conviction. $250,000. The room gasped. Heads turned. Eyes widened. Even the chandeliers seemed to shiver in the silence that followed. Richard's glass slipped slightly in his hand. Anna's breath caught in her throat. And suddenly the story that had been unfolding in whispers all evening shifted entirely. For a heartbeat, silence held the room. $250,000. The words still hung in the air as if no one dared touch them. The auctioneer blinked, the paddle in his hand momentarily forgotten. Then the murmur began, a low ripple sweeping through the crowd, growing louder with each second. Did he say 250? Who is that man? Carter, did he say Carter? Every head turned, every eye fixed on William Carter. He stood there, hands folded calmly before him, his posture straight but unassuming. There was no grand gesture, no flourish. Only a man speaking from conviction, not performance. Richard's father shifted in his seat, his jaw tightening. He had planned to pledge $50,000 tonight, perhaps 75, enough to keep the Hale name gleaming in the society pages. But now this quiet, unpolished man had shattered the stage before he could even step onto it. Richard's hand tightened around his glass, his smile frozen like glass about to crack. "He's bluffing," he whispered almost to himself. Anna turned, her eyes wide, her heart pounding. "No," she whispered back, "he never bluffs." The auctioneer cleared his throat, regaining his composure. "Mr. Carter, just to confirm, 250,000. "Yes," William said simply. His voice carried not with volume but with weight. "And will this be in the form of cashier's check?" William replied. "Already prepared." Gasps rose again, followed by scattered applause. The room, a moment ago indifferent to his presence, now bent toward him like iron toward a magnet. It was a strange thing to witness. Only minutes earlier, William had been invisible, just another guest, an afterthought to the dazzling crowd. Now people leaned forward, whispering his name, curious, admiring. One woman in pearls murmured, "That's real class." A man in a tailored suit nodded. Unannounced. No theatrics, that's how it's done. The irony was not lost on Anna. She glanced at her husband, who sat stiff, his jaw clenched, the word class echoing in a way he could not control. Richard felt heat crawl up his neck. For weeks he had dreaded this. His father-in-law standing out for the wrong reasons. And yet here it was, William standing out for all the right ones. He leaned toward Anna, his whisper sharp. Where would he even get that kind of money? Anna's eyes filled with tears, but not of shame, of pride. "Maybe by working harder than you've ever imagined," she said softly. Richard's lips pressed thin, his hands trembling against the tablecloth. The auctioneer, sensing the moment, invited William to say a few words. William hesitated, then stepped forward. His voice was steady, carrying across the ballroom with quiet authority. "I don't come from wealth," he began. "I've lived my life with sawdust on my clothes and calluses on my hands. Some would call that simple. Maybe it is." He paused, eyes sweeping the room. "But I've learned that class isn't measured by the cut of your suit or the weight of your wallet. It's measured by the respect you give, the sacrifices you make, and the love you leave behind." The room was silent, every ear straining to catch his words. "I give tonight not to prove anything, but because I know what it means when a child has a chance at a future. My daughter had that chance because every extra dollar I earned went to her education, her dreams. She stands here today because of sacrifice, and I want other children to have that same chance." His voice caught slightly, but he pressed on. "So yes, I am simple, but simplicity builds strong foundations, and foundations are what hold families and futures together." When he stepped back, the applause began softly. Then it swelled, growing louder until the entire hall was on its feet. Anna couldn't stop crying. She had always known her father's worth, but to see the world finally see it too, it was overwhelming. She rose, wrapping her arms around him, whispering through her tears, "I'm so proud of you, Dad." William hugged her gently. "Always for you, sweetheart." At the Hale table, silence reigned. Richard's mother dabbed her lips with her napkin, her eyes downcast. Richard's father shifted uncomfortably, his carefully crafted presence crumbling under the weight of William's authenticity. And Richard sat frozen, his pride shattered. The man he had called too simple had outshone them all, not with performance but with truth. As the applause faded and the auction resumed, whispers lingered in the air. William Carter, a name now tied to generosity, dignity, and class. For the first time in his life, Richard understood. Class was not about being seen. It was about being remembered for the right reasons. And William Carter, the simple carpenter, would be remembered long after the chandeliers dimmed and the champagne glasses emptied. The applause that followed William Carter's pledge still echoed in the hall long after the gavel struck. Even as the auction resumed, people found their attention wandering back to him, the carpenter in the modest suit who had just redefined the evening. It wasn't just the sum of money. Others had given more, and many had given often, but few had given with such clarity, such dignity. Few had spoken words that felt less like performance and more like truth. The lesson lingered, unspoken yet undeniable. Class was not about show. It was about substance. Richard Hale sat at the table, his hands stiff on the cloth, the wine in his glass untouched. The smile he had worn all evening had vanished, replaced by something harsher, a quiet storm brewing behind his eyes. He had always prided himself on control of his image, his words, his world. But tonight, control had slipped away. Around him, whispers buzzed. Impressive. Did you know him? The Carters, who are they? Each whisper felt like a blade, cutting into the carefully constructed wall Richard had built between his world and Anna's past. He had worked so hard to keep those lines separate. And now, in one simple act, William had erased the boundary altogether. Worse still, people admired him for it. Richard's chest tightened. Admiration was his currency, his lifeblood. To see it flow toward another, toward the very man he had dismissed, was unbearable. Anna, on the other hand, felt her heart swell in ways she hadn't known possible. For years she had lived with the quiet tension of two worlds, the warmth of her father's simplicity and the polish of her husband's refinement. She had tried to reconcile them, to make space for both. But tonight, she realized she didn't need to reconcile anything. Her father had always been enough, more than enough. As she sat beside him, watching strangers approach to shake his hand, to thank him, call his words inspiring, she felt tears sting her eyes. She wanted to stand on the stage herself and shout, "This is my father, the man who gave me everything." Instead, she simply held his arm tighter, letting her pride speak in silence. Richard's parents were less vocal, but their discomfort was plain. His mother fiddled with her pearl necklace, avoiding eye contact with those who praised William. His father forced a polite smile, but the stiffness in his jaw betrayed him. They had come tonight expecting to bask in admiration, to reinforce their family stature. Instead, they had been overshadowed not by wealth but by character, and character was something they could not purchase. When the auction ended and the crowd spilled into the night, William stepped out quietly, as if slipping away from his own triumph. Anna walked beside him, her hand looped through his arm. "Dad," she whispered, her voice trembling with pride, "you were extraordinary," echoed softly. "I was just myself. That's what makes it extraordinary." Behind them, Richard followed, his steps heavy, his mind a whirlwind. He watched as guests stopped William to thank him, to shake his hand. Some even bypassed Richard entirely, focusing their admiration on the man he had called too simple. It burned. When the crowd thinned and they reached the quiet of the parking lot, Richard finally spoke. His voice was low, sharp. "Where did you get that money?" William turned to him calmly. "I worked, I saved for years." Richard scoffed. "On carpentry, that doesn't add up." William's gaze didn't waver. "I never spent much on myself. Every extra dollar went into savings. It wasn't for me, it was for Anna, for her future. When she made her own way, I kept saving for nights like this." Richard shook his head, disbelief etched on his face. "You embarrassed me, my family." Anna's voice cut through, fierce and unyielding. "No, Richard, he honored us, all of us. You're just too proud to see it." The silence that followed was heavier than any argument. News of the pledge spread quickly. By morning, articles appeared online. "Local carpenter donates $250,000 at gala, true class. A lesson from William Carter." Photographs of William standing humbly beside the stage circulated, his words quoted again and again. Class isn't measured by the cut of your suit or the weight of your wallet. It's measured by the respect you give, the sacrifices you make, and the love you leave behind. Strangers left comments praising him. Some called him a hero. Others simply said they wished more men like him existed. William Reed none of it. He spent the morning in his workshop, hands steady as he sanded a piece of oak, the rhythm of his craft unchanged. Fame meant little to him. What mattered was the cause he had supported, the children who might now have a chance. But Anna read every word, her pride growing with each line. For Richard, the morning brought no peace. His phone buzzed with messages, colleagues forwarding articles, acquaintances commenting on William's speech. Some congratulated him on having such a father-in-law. Others teased him lightly, saying, "Looks like Carter stole the show." Each message was salt on a wound. That afternoon, Richard sat in his office, staring at his reflection in the glass. He saw the tailored suit, the polished shoes, image he had built so carefully. And yet beneath it he saw what others must have seen, a man overshadowed by authenticity. For the first time he wondered if his father had been wrong. Maybe the world didn't judge you by your weakest link. Maybe it judged you by your strongest. And William, against all his expectations, was the strongest link in his family's chain. The realization cut deep, but it also planted something he didn't recognize at first: respect. That evening, Anna visited her father. They sat at the kitchen table, the same one where she had once done her homework under his watchful eye. "Do you realize what you did last night?" she asked. William smiled faintly. "I gave what I could." "No, Dad, you changed how people see you, how they see us." He shook his head. "People forget quickly. What matters is what lasts." Anna reached across the table, taking his hand. "What lasts is you, the man you are, and I want you to know I'll never forget. No matter what Richard says, no matter what his family thinks. You are my measure of class, always." William's eyes softened. "That's all I need to hear." In the end, the lesson was not just for Richard, nor for the Hale family, nor even for the glittering crowd that had applauded in the ballroom. It was for anyone who had ever confused wealth with worth, polish with substance, performance with truth. William Carter had lived his life in simplicity. And yet, in one quiet evening, he reminded them all, true class is not about standing above others. It is about standing with dignity, even when others try to place you below. The night of the auction slowly faded into memory, but the lesson remained. People forgot the gowns, the champagne, the chandeliers. They forgot who bid on the paintings, who bought the vacations, who signed the checks with flourish. But they remembered William Carter, not because of the number he pledged, though it had shocked the room, but because of the way he carried himself, because of the way he spoke about love, sacrifice, and dignity, because he reminded them, if only for a fleeting moment, that the worth of a man is not measured in wealth, but in the life he has given to others. In the weeks that followed, William returned to his routines. He sanded wood in his workshop, brewed his coffee each morning, walked slowly down the quiet streets of his neighborhood. Fame did not follow him here, nor did he seek it. Anna visited often. She brought flowers, told stories from the city, and sometimes just sat in silence with him on the porch. Those moments meant more to William than any applause. Richard, though still proud, began to soften. He had seen something that night he could not unsee, a man stripped of polish, yet wrapped in true class. Slowly, he began to respect the father-in-law he once dismissed. Years later, when William's hair had turned silver and his steps grew slower, Anna would look at him with the same pride she had felt that night. She would tell her children and grandchildren, "Your grandfather was not wealthy, not powerful, not famous, but he was rich in every way that mattered. And when he stood in a room full of people chasing status, he showed them all what real class was." That was his legacy, not the money, not the headlines, but the example. And so, in the end, William Carter proved that the world may label you too simple, may try to measure you by standards you never agreed to, but dignity will always outshine arrogance. True class is not the suit you wear, the name you carry, or the money you spend. True class is respect, kindness, sacrifice, and love. That is what remains when everything else fades. Sparkle's dear friends, thank you for staying with us through this story on Family Shadows. May it remind you of the quiet strength our fathers and grandfathers carry, often without recognition, often without applause. We wish you good health, peace in your hearts, and happiness within your families. Because in the end, that is the only legacy worth leaving.